Call to order the meeting of May 14th, 2024 Finance and Budget Committee. Take roll.
Councilmember Kelly.
Here.
Committee Member McMillan.
Here.
Councilmember Nguyen.
Here.
Councilmember Nusma.
Here.
And Committee Member Livingston.
Here.
We have a quorum and can do business.
We do. Very good. Let's start with public comment, first with people in the room.
Good afternoon or evening. I'd like to speak, just John Kennedy from the Third Ward. I'd like to speak just briefly about the latest income statement that the city produced and the so-called deficit of 16 million and where that actually comes from. If you take a quick look at the line items,
Recording in progress.
you basically got about $3 million of excessive expenditures, all within services and supplies across 5 different departments. City manager spent $700,000 or 42% over his budget. Administration services spent $1.1 million or 24%. Police 50% at $570,000. Fire, $590,000 at 50%, and health came in at 24% over, or about $53,000. That totals around $3 million. And then you have, obviously, the police and fire increase in salaries. Those within, if you look at what we actually spent in 2023 for additional salaries, it was about $4 million, not 5, which is what's quoted in some of the documents. But the real kicker is in the city manager's office, there's an interfund transfer of $8 million over their budgeted $800,000. So if you add up the overages, $3 million, $4 million, $8.4 million, you hit around $15.5 million, or your 16 million deficit that so many people speak to. If you break that out, salaries, if you compare it to revenue was actually up 6.4 million, or about 5% of the budget, which would have covered the salary increases. What the interfund transfer does, I don't know, but your committee ought to ask those questions. But more importantly, supplies and services are controllable expenses. These are controllable. Any well-run budget operation ought to have these nailed down or an explanation as to why they're so excessive. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next.
Evening, committee members. Dave Ellis, 7th Ward. I'd like just to address the overall process as we start heading into next year's budget. I was at a council meeting last night. Mr. Black gave a presentation on the budget of where things are going on and the lack of consensus that was being displayed, or what he quoted as a lack of display. And I think the process needs to be revamped a little bit. I think he should have addressed this committee first and have you guys do the groundwork to prioritize the services, what the budget's a part of, like Mr. Kennedy said, what we've done in the past. The reason why I'm saying that is I really, as a citizen, I don't want to go through what we went through last year, right, where there's a $30 million lease for new space for City Hall, where there's a $2 million expense for city property, or for any of the other ad hoc purchases the city has done throughout the year without any of this stuff going through the Budget and Finance Committee. I think this committee's charge, and that's why I like this committee, is to do what its stated purpose is to run and organize the finances and the budget for the city of Evanston. It hasn't happened yet, But I think now's a good time, because before we're embarking on next year's budget, you guys set the tenure, the parameters of what the discussion is. And obviously, with the council, if there's no consensus, you guys are the leaders to get that organized and prioritize where the money is being spent, how the money has been spent in the past, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, but at least offer the citizens an explanation of what's going on here. Because right now, it's, from the outside looking at you guys, there's no explanation for much of anything that I can see. So I hope you guys take Mr. Black's advice that there isn't a consensus, and you guys prioritize what you think is important for the city of Evanston. Let it be known to the citizens. They can comment on what you guys are thinking, as opposed to having a debate or an argument or discussion at a council meeting where there's a lot of other things going on. Like last night, there was a lot of other things going on. That's not the time to talk about that. The city council has a lot of business to do. This committee should be focusing on its agenda. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else in the room for public comment? Sure. And Ray, why don't you go next? I think or however we want to do it, if you're interested. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Betty Esther. And listening to the council meeting, and they thank you, talking about the budget and how much money is spent for this. And a friend of mine brought to me the approved budget for last year. And so I'm looking at things in there, and we'd have like our capital improvement project and what we're spending the money on and how much, and then how much is from the year before. I think it's been roughly now about 5 years when Northwestern students from their business school came and worked with the city and did a study to tell them this is how you need to manage things. And in doing this, your property tax should stay low. You don't have to get too many bonds, because we do bonds like it's candy, handing it out to kids. And we kind of need to stop that, because as you do the bonds, we have to pay them back, which means the property owners have to pay it with taxes. Everybody in this city have to pay it, whether you own a building or not. But if you live here, you're going to have to pay the property tax, because if the landlords, which a lot of them do not live here, charge their tenants, they up the rent so that their property, we pay the property tax that you levy on him. Because he's not here, he don't care, we stay here, so we have to pay for it. We don't mind that, but then it comes to the spending and stuff off the funds, and it's not benefiting not the property owners or the renters. And we should definitely look out how we do our business in doing consulting and issuing bonds. So, but if you're going to be issuing bonds that way, why not issue bonds to build and fix affordable housing and have them, the best you want to have, pay for it with the bonds, and the tenants and the people, we are paying it off, and you having something that is stable. And the non-for-profit owners that do own property and rent, they pay property tax. It might not be as much as the regular landowners, but they pay property tax. I know that because when we had our land trust here, the first one, and we had to pay property tax on our little property, and we looked at it and we calculated out what's going to be different, how much is the property tax is going to be, that if it was a regular house sold free and simple and no nonprofit tied to it, how much property tax would be lost. And we figured it out, and it came to the amount of $150. So we was paying the balance of that, and then the city, whoever ate the rest. So that meant whoever was living in our land trust house paid the balance of that property tax. But it was such that it could be affordable.
Okay.
If you have to have people in your town to pay property tax for you to exist. So we need to start taking care of them. If you want to say, I care about all the people and stuff, then, and if you're going to be issuing bonds, then the next 2 bonds that you issue should be for creating affordable housing, not some developer that's going to come in, walk away, and the tenants and stuff suffer from whoever they get to manage their property. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else in the room that would like to make a comment? Sure.
Hi, Mary Rosinski. Thank you all for being here. I'm here just to speak to as we enter the budget season. I think everyone ahead of me has said a lot of what I would have said, so I won't repeat it, but I think they are right on target. I had 2 questions I was hoping you might address tonight or in the near future. One is, I had thought about a year or so ago, 2 years ago, that there was some agreement or ordinance that if the city was going to go outside its budget for a fund, that you guys could vote for a project, but they would have to tell you, we're going to, we're in this project, we have the money for it, and just so you know, we are $5 million or $10 million over budget for last year's budget on this item. Does that make sense? Anyways, I don't know that that's happening. And the second thing, like last night, I know there was a project that it said it's unbudgeted, is for traffic, streets, whatever. And I just have a hard time with all these unbudgeted expenses, because our budget is our guardrail so that we don't go off a financial cliff. And for some reason, those guardrails seem to go down every time that city staff recommends a huge project. As we all know, the 909 Davis Street, whether or not you're for it or against it, it could have gone into this budget. It should have been planned for. We, as a taxpayer, I'm really counting on all of you to help keep those guardrails and run this city with the plan, and staff work with you to say, this is what our budget are, and they stay. And if they're going to need it ahead of time, we can't be having all these unexpected major expenses coming up at the last moment when you're all really busy too. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, there was one other question tonight. The water issue on the city council last night. It said that they wanted general bond, and part of it was for the water. But I thought the water bond is a revenue bond, not a geo bond, and I was wondering if you could address how they are different, or are they the same, or should the water project be under a revenue bond for the water department and the other for a general bond?
Thank you. Okay, anybody else in the room? Sure.
Hello, Tricia Conley, Second Ward. A couple of things. We talk a lot about deficit, but we never use the term overspending. And I think it's an interesting thing. Maybe they're different. I don't know. But, as Mary was saying, there is a budget. There are guardrails there. And the question is, why are we running into a deficit? I get it. There's unplanned expenses that happen. But meanwhile, we're still buying land, which it's unclear what we're going to do with. Apparently, it's for affordable housing. Well, that's grand. But in the meantime, folks, we've got people in the Fifth Ward that have to leave their building, and understandably, there's some needs over there. Why are we not spending money toward that versus now we're buying a place down on Howard? I don't know. Is it about TIF money? Explain it to the taxpayers, and let's get real clear on what's happening in our town financially. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else in the room? And then, so online, is there anyone that has said they want to do public comment?
There's no one else online.
Okay, very good. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. And I will say many of those items are on our agenda to discuss tonight. So Sherry is on our way in. Let's go ahead and approve the minutes. We do have enough people to do that from the prior meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes in the packet? And is there a?
I will move approval of the minutes from the April 9th meeting.
Okay. Second. All right. Let's go ahead and vote on the minutes.
We'll start with you, Councilmember Newsma. Councilmember Newsma?
Aye.
Committee Member Livingston?
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly?
Aye. Is Chair Reikes attending online?
She will be here in person.
Yes, I'm online, and I'm going to be 5 minutes away. So.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you. Committee Member Millen, I don't know if I got your vote. Did I get you? Sorry.
Aye.
Sorry, thank you. So, Councilmember Wynn? Aye. And Committee Member Rikus?
Aye.
Okay, very good. And Chairman Rikus did ask that if she was not here by the time we got to the next point, that we would go to the benchmarking information next. Is everyone okay? And reordering the agenda. So that is to
D3.
D3.
Yeah, so I
So
will
we'll
move
go-
discussion of item D3.
Second.
Okay.
So no formal presentation from me on item D3. I just, again, put together a number of tables as a starting our series on presenting comparable community data with the communities that you all approved in February. So if there are questions either about this data that I included here, or if there are other ideas of future things you would like to see added, welcoming that feedback at this point.
Thanks for putting this together, but there's, I think, a lot of different measurements that we might want to also explore. None of these really address spending on a per capita basis, so I think that that's something we want to drill down to. So should we just submit to you the other things that we would like to see added to this?
Yeah, an email.
Okay.
Yes, an email would work, or if there's other comments now on things, we can take note of that too.
And I think this was viewed as just a start on some of the balance sheet sort of items, but it is certainly not the end product.
I think more important than the levy, that's sort of an after-the-fact number, is total budget and budgets per capita. I think that gives us a better sense of comparing cities and their budgeting efficiencies and expenses more than the end up, because we know like that Skokie has a tax base but what we want to compare really is how they're running their budgets and comparing those. So I think overall budgets and then maybe per capita, apples to apples with recreation department and everything else. So I think that would be more helpful. Thank you.
Councilmember Newsma.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what the previous comments were. I would also want to pay particular attention to debt levels, debt ratios, pension parameters and also capital improvement projects. So what starts out as a 3-page report suddenly gets to be
It does.
6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 pages.
Right. I think and we can add, over time, certainly. One item that I would add to that list, I think table 1.2 is very informative. I would consider also, although we do not control the school district levies, it would be interesting to get a table that combines that element, those two elements as well. I know that, as you've mentioned, some of these other areas, some of these other school or communities are not a clean cut as much as Evanston is relative to school districts, because you can have part of a community that goes to one district, part to another district. But I think that would still be very informative to give more of the overall picture of, not 100%. We don't need to, look at mosquito abatement and all those others, but just sort of try to get to what is the, where do we get to substantially all of the property tax bill, and how does that overall levy compare relative to per capita, but also property values.
And I would just want to add, again, the total budgets are more important with regard to the school districts, again, because each city has its own, in the way it's collecting its, meeting its expense needs. But what we're interested in is really in comparing the budgets. So just the levy alone doesn't really give us that much information. So again, the school districts, each district's total budget broken down per capita, comparing that gives us far more information to sort of benchmark ourselves on than a levy. Thank you.
Okay, I think,
Okay.
Sherry, maybe that's for you to take. I think we are not the school districts, right? But it would be interesting to know there is a recurring discussion that, property taxes are disproportionately high, and let's understand, where are we compared to the peer communities? So, anyway, I will hand this back over to Sherry.
Okay, so thank you for your patience, everyone. So now we're going to go to FB1. Clayton, do you want to kick us off on this? I've spent a lot of time with Clayton and Hitesh on this. He's going to go through the ordinance, and can you kind of give quickly the history why we have to do this and go through your presentation?
To keep it official, shall I make a motion?
Yes, please.
Well, this is FB1 for action, so I will move approval of Ordinance 43024, authorizing the city manager to amend the total fiscal year 2023 budget, resulting in a net reduction of $52,234,143 to a new total of $344,972,907.
All right, thank you, Chair Rikus and committee. So just a few slides to kind of outline why what parts of this we are required by state law to do, which parts we are not required by state law to do, and sort of an explanation for what it is you're looking at. So a budget amendment is required when actual expenses in an individual fund exceed budgeted expenses in any fund. State law says that we have to amend our budget, otherwise our auditors will put a note in our annual audit report that dings us for not explaining or adjusting our budget to account for those overages. A budget amendment is not required for variance in revenues. So if we bring in more revenues than budgeted, we don't have to do a budget amendment for that. And importantly, too, the budget amendment does not have an impact on a deficit or surplus. A deficit is when your actual expenses are higher than actual revenues. A surplus is when your actual revenues are higher than actual expenses. Our budget amendment is talking about expenses. So when we reduce a budget or increase a budget, we're not increasing or reducing a deficit or creating some surplus. It's literally just touching the expense side. And you have to tie in revenues whenever you start talking about surpluses and deficits.
Can I ask a question just on that?
I'd rather get through the full presentation if I may. So in the item, you do see where we have a list of funds where there are increases. These are the funds where we did spend more than the allocated budget. There are 11 of those funds found in the ordinance that show where we did overspend the appropriated amount. The biggest number is in the general fund. And all year last year, you'll recall, we came to this committee and said wage increases higher than budget. We asked you to approve a transfer to the insurance fund and the fleet fund. That's the transfer that was referenced during public comment that was not budgeted, but approved by this committee and by City Council. There was also a handful of capital projects that we talked about all year last year. The animal shelter, the Main Street improvements, and many of those where we transferred general money to cover those overages. And so that's a vast majority of this 15 million, and the memo explains how much of that is. So we're required to amend our budget for these 11, and in each of these 11 funds, the overage was covered with the fund balance within that fund for all except for fleet. And we talked about doing a transfer to the fleet fund last year to cover the overages that we were seeing in that fund. Also in the budget amendment is a list of 6 funds where we significantly underspent what was budgeted. We are not required to amend the budget to reflect these under budget amounts, but we felt and started last year doing this because it seems as though this tells the other side of the story. So we know there are those funds where we overspent, but there are also funds where we underspent. And addressing both of those in a budget amendment helps paint the full picture. The ordinance very clearly shows which funds are increases and which funds we're asking to decrease. So just to explain further the net deficit and surplus and why this is important. So our 2023 budget said that we would have a deficit of 10 million in the general fund. We overspent expenses by 16 million, which means if revenues were completely accurate, we would have had a deficit of 26 million. But fortunately, revenues also came in over budget, and we ended with a deficit that was actually less than what we budgeted. So we ended with a deficit of 8.6 million, which was less than the deficit that was budgeted at 10.1 million. So if you take out those expenses for wage increases, and if we had appropriately budgeted those had the crystal ball and knew where those wage increases were going to land, this deficit that was budgeted would have been quite a bit shorter. So that's sort of the introduction and the concept, and I'm happy to answer any questions too.
Yes, so just to reemphasize, we either approved or discussed all these, and you updated us along the way how that was going to impact. The one question you and I talked about, and Laura, maybe we can weigh in, is the big number is the CIP. So, for example, the water, we know that's not going to happen. I'm just using an example. Let's say we have a $30 million project, and we know that it's going to be done over 3 years. Do we want to just budget 10 million for year one and then do 10 and 10? Do we want to approve the whole project? Because, that's what, 40, I can't read, it's a $40 million difference. So it's just how do we want to be transparent with this? So I'll turn it over.
Certainly. My name is Laura Biggs. I'm the city engineer. That is an excellent question that I would say we wrestle with every year, and we actually do it differently fund by fund. So in things like IDOT projects that are really large transportation projects, we're really required to obligate everything sort of up front. Versus the water fund, we tend to spread it out in the year that we expect to expend it. But there's definitely a need to try to decide what the preference for that is in terms of the optics as well, because I think we can manage it different ways. It really depends on how the city wants to look at committing its funding for these large multi-year projects.
And I think that might be a good discussion for our group because, when you start to have this big change, I think it alerts. I mean, when I first looked at it, I was alerted, and I'm a finance person. So, but I think, Claire, Councilman Kelly?
Well, I have a lot of questions, but one, I really would rather we discontinue the practice of reducing the budget, because what that does, one, in a sense, it erases both surplus from the public view as well as overspending. So I think we need to go back to the way we've always done it, and the way most cities do it is you simply do what's required by the state, and that is to amend for overspending. And it's really important because I can't remember right off, I think it was like 420 million or I'm sorry, last year it was 397. That's not just a big amorphous number that we just can kind of shift around. Those are each one of those funds are budgets that are to be respected. And so when we do this sort of thing like, well, we had a lot here and we overspent here, it really doesn't give a clear and transparent picture as to what's happened. And what we need to understand is that there is an issue. We still do have an issue with sticking to our budget. And it's very important. When we overspend, I think it's total $18.2 million, that needs to be transparent to the residents. If there's surplus, there's surplus. We also need greater transparency around the surplus. It took me, a lot of emails to finally ascertain that currently with our cash and investment balance right now, we have over $27 million. And this isn't reserve money. It's not assigned money. This is excess reserves. And these are funds that absolutely must be brought to us and transparently so that, as a democratic body, we decide how those unassigned funds, these are not reserve funds. This is in addition to, $20+ million in reserve funds, how that gets spent. So when we have needs like what we're hearing about with the Wesley residents, so we have needs we do need to, I would say, fund even at a greater rate our pensions. This will help our residents more. We can't even begin that discussion because we're not having these full transparent discussions about surplus. And meanwhile, we hear, council members saying, oh, we have a deficit, we got to raise taxes, but we're not talking transparently about these excess reserves, unassigned funds, you can call them what you want, but they are there. And so I think when we do this thing where we reduce our budget by 50 or whatever million it is right now, what we're doing is saying, like, mechanically what happens? It looks like, oh, we just reduced it. We're not stating, okay, we have this surplus from last year and we overspent by this amount. Those are the two things that the residents and this council and this committee need to be perfectly clear on. So I really ask that we go back to the way we've done it forever until last year, where we amend for the overspending. And I have other questions and comments about some of these funds, but I'll stop there for the moment. I know Leslie had a question.
Well,
I think Councilman Newsman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Next. Yeah.
Sorry, this whole exercise to me is a little bit goofy. I get that it's required by state law, so we have to do it. And if nothing else, it's an opportunity to kind of look back and review, after some time has passed, our financial performance for the previous year. But to amend a budget is retroactively kind of an inherently kind of silly exercise where it's just paperwork. So if we're going to do that anyway, let's, in full transparency, tell the public the whole picture. And I would disagree with Councilmember Kelly that we should continue the current practice of amending the budget to show not only the increases, but also the decreases. But as I'm looking through the numbers here, and this is the whole point of this exercise, is to allow us to ask these questions. I'm looking at the $15 million overspend in the general fund, which seems like an awful lot. I 100% agree. But if we look at where that spending was coming from, the biggest single slice of that pie was higher than budgeted wage increases, just over $5 million. We had to under budget that number. To be fiscally responsible, we had to under budget for wage increases. The more money we put in the budget to pay wages, the higher the bar we set when negotiating union contracts. So there's no way that if we are doing our job properly, that we would have properly budgeted for wage increases, given the fact that we were negotiating 3 contracts last year. Different story, perhaps, for the next few years when those contracts are not up for negotiation. The next highest hit was $4.9 million transfer from the general fund to the insurance and fleet fund, moving money from one internal bucket to another. And we spent it out of fleet, but let's have that conversation when we talk about the fleet budget. Then going down the list, number 3 was overages on capital projects of $3.6 million. And this is, where we should have this is where we should be focusing our attention, is, overspending on capital projects. and the numbers that are coming to us here tonight are numbers associated with projects for which we had conversations throughout the year, and we are not retroactively approving something that's totally new to us. We're just reviewing what we had approved during deliberations at council and committees last year. So I just had those comments on the fund summary increases. I did want to note, getting back to the fleet services, we were $903,000 over budget there. Is that something we could we have tightened up on fleet services? Could we have ordered fewer vehicles?
Without those folks here in the room, I hate to answer everything, but I do know that they were fully staffed last year, and so that's where wage increases can apply too. So we have probably 20 employees in the fleet fund that we pay, and we budgeted for a 3% wage increase for those folks, but they came in at 13%, I believe. So that salaries and wages are a big part of that.
Okay,
amount.
that's a good point. Fleet
But
services
also-
fund is not just the vehicles, it's the support staff as well.
And also
the
fuel and parts.
Okay.
And so that was where I was going, was fuel prices, part delays, a lot of that kind of came into play. for them.
Then I had a couple questions on the decreases. We had a $500,000 decrease on the MFT fund. We didn't lose that money, did we? MFT funds come from the state. We spend them to maintain our streets. If we don't spend that money, we don't lose it, do we?
Correct. It just sits in our fund balance, and it was money that we didn't spend. I can let Laura talk about what specifically may have happened within
Okay.
the fund.
Every year, IDOT allocates a certain amount that they rebate back to us for the motor fuel tax money. And a few years ago, they also did a short-term 3-year Rebuild Illinois bond that they pushed out through MFT. They track the money, and we need their permission to spend it, but the money just sits into an account. There are these Rebuild Illinois funds that do have a deadline that happens to be July of next year, 2025. But we are substantially spending those out this year.
So the money comes in, it'll show up on our fund balance,
Yes.
but it is allocated.
It's allocated to the city of Evanston,
Okay.
and it's only going to be used for the city of Evanston, but the city of Evanston can only use it in certain ways, and they have to ask permission from IDOT every time they use it.
And so have we asked permission to use all that money in a certain way, and we just haven't gotten to those projects yet?
We have, we developed an excess balance because we got almost $5 million in Rebuild Illinois over 2 to 3 years. And we have been spending down MFT more than we normally do, but it just so happens we had a lot more money coming in. That is unfortunately sunsetting. And I wish I could say that that would continue, because then we would plan for it, but that is unfortunately not going to happen. However, for the moment, where we're set at, other than some extra costs, particularly for right now, this year we're spending a lot on the reconstruction of Leon Place, which you may have noticed as you try to enter the Civic Center parking lot from the south. That project is beyond what we would normally spend MFT on. We are also spending it down with the Green Bay, our match for the Green Bay Road project that's going into construction. Typically, we only use MFT money for street resurfacing and then some maintenance costs. So we are using the extra money to offset when we would normally be selling GO bonds to pay for things like matching costs or unexpected projects.
Okay. And then I had one other question. Laura, you're probably the right person, but we're showing a $7 million decrease in the capital improvement fund. But I'm also looking at the increase in the general fund of overages and capital projects. So how do those two?
I think there's several things happening simultaneously. There were some crazy price increases on some of our projects last year as we went through a period of 15 to 20% inflation per year for several years in construction. That seems to be slowing down, And the predictions are that's going to modulate more at 5% per year, which is still not great, but is much better than 20% per year. In order to cover those, because a lot of those costs, like the animal shelter, were coming in early in the year, and we had these excess reserves. A decision.
So those, like for the animal shelter costs, are those in the general fund or in the CIP fund?
They're in the capital fund. Money was transferred from the general fund
got it.
to the capital fund so that we did not issue more debt to cover those costs when we had the general reserve. Simultaneously, every year we plan a budget for general obligation debt, and we typically come in 20 to 30% under the actual debt issue, related to the fact that projects just get stalled for a variety of reasons. Lack of staffing, or we need an MWRD permit that we didn't get, so the whole thing got held up, or a variety of things that just happen. So for that reason, there are also decreases in the expenses in the capital fund and the GO debt. And that's what you're seeing as we talk about the GO bond issue. There was a substantial decrease in the proposed GO debt for 2022 and 2023 projects. And that really had to do with the normal attrition of just not everything gets done.
Okay, we have a lot of other people, so, and if we can, let's try to stick with what we're voting on today, because these are all great discussions on budget items, but what we're trying to decide is if we're going to vote on the increases and the decrease, but Committee Member Livingston, and then, or McMillan, then Livingston, then Councilmember Kelly. But if
yeah,
everyone
I-
could keep 5 to 10 minutes.
Fine. I would just like to go on record that I think this is a policy I really don't like. I think what you end up doing is really subverting the fund accounting here. And you also sort of neuter the council's ability to say yes or no to increases. Point of clarification, I do not believe that it is by law that you have to reduce a budget or amend a budget down. I think you do have to, I believe, and Councilmember Kelly, can you help me? I do believe you have to if you increase. So the reason why I like the idea of just increasing during, on a go-forward basis is getting approval from council is when you do make these over expenditures, coming to council and saying, this will put us out of budget. And then I think there'll be more scrutiny to it. And I think it provides great guardrails. I really don't like this idea of coming back and just throwing everything in the mix. It would sort of be like David Livingston as the treasurer of ITW saying, well, fasteners didn't do so great, but industrials did well, and it's all in the mix anyway. That's just not how I think you effectively run a business, or a city. That's my opinion.
Thank you. If I could just add a couple of quick comments. Agree with a lot of the capital points that Jonathan brought up. We could improve, I think, how we're doing the capital budgeting, and an approach a lot of organizations take, approve the project, but then on an annual basis, what are we going to spend? So maybe that's something to consider, not putting the full amount of the capital project in, because it does catch a lot of media and other attention. The city is spending $400 million. Well, for a city, capital looks like spending in a way it doesn't look like for a for-profit organization where those costs are just capitalized. So we can probably make an improvement there about getting a project approved in its totality. It can always get changed later. But in our budget, what do we really think we're going to spend that year? That would probably be an improvement. But, regardless of the amendment here, the original budget exists. This is just aligning things. It's not like we're getting rid of the records relative to the original budget. And I just don't see the harm in sort of aligning everything at the end of the year. Certainly the overspends need to be approved. But there were some comments that there's a lack of transparency. I don't understand how what was charged to the general fund could have been more transparent than what we did. We specifically the increases in wages, were discussed. There is the dynamic that Jonathan was talking about of whatever you put in budget is your opening bid on your labor negotiations. I mean, you put 12% in there, you're going to end up higher. I think we ended up at a number that both sides could live with, but that is your sort of opening position. I would want to know more specifically, where did we miss on revenues and how do we need to factor that into next year, right? That's probably the most informative. I had a sense that maybe there would be some upside on revenues. Fortunately, there was, and it was able to cover the unfavorable wage increases due primarily to the new labor. The transfer to the insurance funds and fleet funds, we talked about that multiple times. That should be a surprise to nobody, that we were using general fund excess reserves to fix a long-term problem in insurance that had been a negative fund balance for years due to a specific issue from years ago, and that we were not keeping pace with inflation or spending in the fleet funds, and also had generated a deficit that needed to be fixed. So there was no, I don't see how anything could be more transparent than those discussions, as well as the specific approvals we gave for overages in capital projects that we wanted to fund out of the then, excess reserves in the general fund. So I take issue that anything is not transparent. I don't know how it could not be more transparent, but there are factors we want to inform ourselves in next year's budgeting. So.
Okay, and the last comment will be, I think you're the last one
So
lit up. But
I want to say, the first year that I was elected on here, and we were to approve, staff had overspent by $11 million. And I thought, and then this was 6 months after the fact. I mean, the way standard is to stay within budget. And when I say within budget, I don't mean within the global amount of 300, 400 million. I mean by fund amount. So I was kind of shocked, like, wow, we're supposed to approve $11 million. So I held it over. And I held it over and got an agreement from the then interim city manager to say that going forward, in the name of transparency, Mr. Livingston, that staff would come to us first and say, we want approval to exceed the approved fund budget for this amount, ideally before spending it. And that's what was discussed and agreed. Well, that never happened. So we look at council, we get hundreds of items to approve for spending. At no point are we saying, we would like a permission to exceed what had been previously approved democratically in the truth and taxation hearings and everything else. We're not asked that. We're just asked to approve expenditures over and over again. So it's a little bit like uninformed consent. I've referred to that before when we're exceeding. So now we're looking at an $18.3 million overspending. And again, I would like to know a little bit of the mechanics. So this is not standard to reduce. No, you're right, Ms. McMillan, you do not have to amend your budget to reduce it. In fact, I've talked to people at very high levels. They're like, I don't know why we're doing that. You only have to amend your budget for over expenditures. So this is a big number. I think it's 87 point, what was the total, that $87.2 million off in terms of total expenses. Now, that's an enormous number. How much of that did we actually collect money for? Of that 87 that we came in under for expenses, so we ended up out of a total tab of 397 million, around 300 and city management, the fiscal budget to a new total from, what was it, I can't find the total, but anyway, around 397. Of that 87 million, how much of that was money collected to pay for those expenses?
None of it.
So all of that was,
And it's tied to bonds and loans and fund balances that are sitting in our fund balance, things like ARPA. We're sitting with our ARPA money in the bank. We didn't spend the ARPA money. We still have it. We received it, and we're just rebudgeting it to spend it later. But when you look at things like capital improvements and water and sewer, the capital projects we didn't move forward with had loans and bonds tied to them that we didn't issue or collect.
But
to-
I think you
to
just
pay
said for motor fuel tax, for example, there's a $500,000 extra sitting there. We did collect that, you just confirmed. That was
The
money
state-
collected.
The state provided it
Right,
to us.
we got it, so we took that money. So we're reducing now, so if you could just walk me through mechanically, how do we reduce that amount by $500,000? What happens to it? If we've reduced it, it's gone.
Sitting
Why
in
isn't it,
the-
it should be surplus
It's-
and not a reduction?
It's sitting in the FY '25 budget for us to now spend in FY '25 because we didn't spend it in FY
But in essence, we've
24.
erased it when we
You know,
reduced
we-
it.
we have
Let
a-
me just finish, I'm sorry. And the same with sewer fund. The sewer fund, it's a $2 million. Did we collect that money for the sewer fund?
I mean, we collect sewer rates, so. to
I
that
understand
end-
for bonds, I just want to be clear though. So I don't like this idea of reducing, this is non-standard.
Okay,
Let me just finish. Very few cities do this. And some of this money we actually collected from residents, whether it's through taxes. And so to reduce it is in essence to erase it. And really, this isn't, and I've scoured the state, I found two cities that do this, and it's, one's, well, I won't go into the details
Okay,
on it.
we,
But-
these are good discussions, but today we are just have to decide on this ordinance if we're going to
Right, but
commingle it, separate it. There is an attachment, so it is very transparent. There's an attachment with the ordinance that shows
Sherry, I'm
by
talking
the
about
fund.
transparency in terms of exceeding our approved budgets through the truth and taxation hearings. And that, I would say, is not transparent to our public. This maneuver to reduce makes it even
Okay,
less transparent.
okay,
And I want to say, again, Waukegan, the former CFO of Cicero, he does use this technique, but we have not been able to find many other cities that do this. So why we are going out of our way, instead of simply amending it for the increases, I find very problematic.
just my opinion, I think it's more transparent to show both sides, but in your experience of,
I'd be happy to respond
Both
to
sides
that
is a
point.
surplus?
We just, this evening, or this afternoon, after we had the conversation, we started looking through our comps, and we found this from the Village of Palatine. They come back and they do a big decrease, very similar to what it is that we're doing. So I did this when I was with the Village of Schaumburg. We very regularly came back and decreased in the interest of transparency. We can go through the rest of our comps and see if it's common. As I
what if
said,
we
it's not
separated it
required.
out in the
common.
ordinance? We said that we have an increase of expenses
The
and a
ordinance-
decrease.
The ordinance, it's not a surplus, but the ordinance does explain that and show
Okay.
that difference.
Okay, I thank you for all your comments, very productive, but I think we're ready to vote. Do I have a motion?
Yes, there was a motion.
A motion. Do I have a second?
Yeah, the second.
Okay.
And just for the record, Bobby Burns, Councilmember Burns is on the call virtually now for the roll call. Councilmember Nusma,
Aye.
Committee Member Livingston,
Aye.
Committee Member Jared Rikus, excuse me.
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly,
No.
Committee Member McMillan,
No.
Councilmember Wynn, and Councilmember Burns.
Aye, and I just wanted everybody to know I've been on the call for the entire discussion. Aye.
Yeah, I was waiting to find a time to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next discussion is going to be on the policy for unbudgeted capital expenses. We'll go back to I'm sorry. FB2, our staff is going to be out at the next meeting on June 14th. And we need to make a change. I'm unavailable the 21st. Could everyone make June 28th?
18.
Oh, May.
Yeah.
Potentially the 18th. I'm actually out that day. Would the 25th work? June 25th? You're not available?
Not for me. Should we?
Okay, I could be here for an hour on the 18th. I just have another board meeting that I'm committed to. Is there another day in the week that would work? I know you guys have a lot of meetings. When are you back?
Could we possibly just align on a date and then somehow approve it outside of our meeting? We know we have a problem for the existing date of the 11th.
Okay.
So we'll just
Does the
find something
19th work for everyone, just so we can get that on the record?
The week of 18th, I think that's the next.
Okay, let's plan on the 19th.
The 19th is Juneteenth, and the city offices are closed.
17th, or is that a board meeting? Okay, so let's do the 17th, and if we need to change it, you guys, everyone good for that date? Okay, thank you. We'll do that. Okay, Laura, you're going to,
Do we need to vote on that?
Yeah, do we need?
do we need a vote? Someone want to make a motion?
I'll move that we meet on June 17th.
I'll second that.
Okay.
Okay. To take a vote, Councilmember Nusma,
Aye.
Committee Member Livingston,
Aye.
Chair Rikus,
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly,
Aye.
Committee Member McMillan,
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn, Councilmember Burns.
Okay, now, D1, we're going to have a discussion about a policy for unbudgeted capital expenses, which I think is very important. Laura's going to bring us through this maybe 10, 15 minutes because we have some other things on the agenda. But really today, we've discussed this for 2 meetings now. We want to give the go-ahead for Laura so that she can get the policy drafted and be in compliance and talk to legal. So why don't you walk us through the parts of the policy?
Sure. And yes, we did an initial thing to talk about how some decisions have to be made quickly to avoid unintended costs. And then at our April meeting, your April meeting, we talked about these items: time sensitivity, wanting to balance the individual fund budgets as much as possible, and overall, if we can't do that, at least balancing the city budget with our expenses. So talking with staff and the chair, this is sort of where we're heading with this policy. First of all, it does seem as if the committee is most concerned about some very specific funds, namely the Capital Improvement Fund and the General Fund. And so staff is seeking guidance on, does this policy for every fund, or are we focusing in on just these 2 funds, which would be a more manageable prospect, but we want to make sure we're getting you the information we would need.
Is the committee okay if we just focus on the general and the capital improvement fund?
I wonder if we might want to include the water fund because, sorry, let me turn my microphone. I wonder if we might want to include the water fund because we do have some pretty significant ongoing expenses in that fund. Possibly parking, anticipating that there might be a parking garage renovation or reconstruction at some point. So I want to make sure we're not
Sure.
limiting ourselves.
No, and that's fine. And I think you're definitely correct about the water fund experiencing challenges, so it would make sense to include that one for sure.
Councilman Kelly?
I would agree with Councilmember Nusma. I would just say if we're talking about exceeding approved budgets, that any budget that exceeds 500, $500,000 seems pretty high to me to be waiting for that to come to us. But I would reduce that to 250, and I would say any fund that we've approved, legally approved, an amount that should come to us. I don't know why we would exempt any.
We're not talking funds, we're talking CIP.
Right, but I'm saying that I think that this should be amended to say any expenditures that exceed any approved fund balance, fund amount should come to us.
Okay, and as part of your analysis, you're going to look at 250 and 500 and see how many times that would have occurred. And a lot of our funds aren't even that large, so I would not envision it impacting. But the 5 funds we just said, I think, will have the most relevance.
Yes.
But it should include more than just CIP. I mean, I'm right. I mean, if we're talking, our main concern is to try to, bring about a little more budgetary.
No, she's going to look at all the funds, but like I said, a lot of them are not that large, so we'll look at all the funds.
I mean, let's clarify this. There are capital projects that would occur within parking, within the parking fund.
Yes.
And within the water fund.
Yes.
So I mentioned those 2 funds not as funds, but in the context of capital projects.
So in full disclosure, Michael has started looking at some of the unbudgeted expenditures, and the worst offenders are not necessarily capital projects. So they're not just occurring in the capital fund, but they're generally occurring in the general fund when they occur. So that's why we're looking at capital fund, general fund to grab some of those other expenditures, and then The water fund is a very well taken comment. That is a fund that is experiencing a lot of financial challenges at the moment. And parking fund definitely makes sense. It also is experiencing some challenges related to revenue, I believe.
So the policy we're talking about is really limited to capital projects. Councilmember
And,
Kelly.
and general fund.
And general fund, non-capital expenses.
So this is for the
That's-
committee to decide. My first impression was capital projects, but then some things were said at the last meeting that made it seem like any expense that's over a certain amount should be looked at.
Yeah, I think we agree, and we can maybe set different parameters for different funds. But you're going to look at the research. I mean, if there's unbudgeted at 500,000, I think it should come to us, and we should be aware of no matter what fund it is.
So we're in agreement that it's primarily capital projects, but also some non-capital expenditures in the general fund.
Yes.
Yeah, and this water and others.
So exceeding any.
Then time sensitivity being an issue, there was a discussion about the necessity sometimes to just move forward with decisions to avoid any unintended cost increases that might happen if we don't. The chair has suggested that when possible, we may choose to schedule an emergency meeting of the Finance and Budget Committee to try to get some concurrence and daylight the challenges before they proceed to City Council. So when possible, we will look at doing
And that we may set a higher dollar amount for that, but that's what I want some research. How often would you have had to come to us with a time-sensitive expenditure? And Clayton and I were talking this morning, maybe a percentage if it doesn't exceed more than 5% of the project, because if it's a huge project, you know, that could be within the realm of an overrun.
Then really focusing on trying to balance fund budgets. So every community, and in Evanston, in my entire history here, has struggled with sometimes you just have a cost overage. But it is not uncommon in our past or in other communities to then just delay another cost or reduce a cost so that the fund stays balanced as much as possible. Because that's just being a good financial practice. And I know Clayton has talked about that was their practice in Schaumburg as well. The past few years with the pandemic, with the ARPA funds, with other things going on have been truly exceptional years for us, and we've gotten away from certain practices. But the staff is totally supportive of making sure that we go back to those practices. So we'll be looking at how as we do this, how can we maintain the fund budgets without exceeding the fund expense. And then overall, if you absolutely have to exceed the fund budget, we still need to figure out how we do not exceed the city's budget for the adopted year. So we really want to look at, as we do these, making sure we identify, if we're not paying for it out of the fund, exactly where it is coming from and how it is being offset by a corresponding reduction elsewhere.
Councilman Kelly?
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's great news. And I agree. I think that's great if we can look at, and I think ideally, as we try to stick to our fund balances that have been approved, if we can do that during that same fiscal year. I mean, I think it's ideal that we're not, looking at these 6 months after the fact, but trying to bring those forward during the same fiscal year. I know that is how many cities do handle the amendments when they do have to amend. And thank you. I also agree if we don't have to exceed the total budget by making adjusted transfers to cover any exceedance.
Committee Member Livingston?
Sure. So this was a little bit of the mixed items from the prior discussion. There's a little bit of difference between operating expenses and capital. There's an enormous difference, okay? And an approach here is we have a capital expenditure for whatever reason we see an overage over 500,000. Could be due to something like you found on the water intake where there's a large concrete thing that you got to take out. Those can be identified and then presumably they're fairly limited. We can talk about those and approve those at the time. With respect to operating expenses, an approach could be a periodic, maybe mid-year and later in the year, review by the finance department to say, based on our current trends, we believe these individual line items are going to be over budget by X, maybe $500,000, maybe it's some other number. That just becomes a recurring discussion item, right? We've done a reforecast for the year. We believe that these individual items are likely to be over budget by X. Let's talk about the reasons why, and is there a plan to offset, or do we fundamentally believe this is going to be an overage? That's an approach, unless it was already clear and approved, like with the wage increases, that this was going to be a budget offset. So it was already discussed. So I think P&L items we can talk about periodically as part of a standing item, maybe quarterly, and you could highlight, we are going over budget on these items. This is why, and this is our proposal, and let's get approval that we're going over. Capital is totally different. Something's come up, cost of steel is up, cost of labor is up, whatever it might be. This individual material project is over by over $500,000. Let's get approval for that. So I think let's not mix them, because an operating expense budget difference grows throughout the year. It's not, you might only then end up talking, if it had to be over 500,000, we're only talking about it at the end of the year because it is built throughout the year. Let's talk about it earlier once you have a view that we think that an individual line item is going to be over by.
So do you want to add a standard review process as part of the policy?
That's what I would do. Have a standard review process for operating expenses and react to large capital differences when those are identified. I think that's just a much more controlled
But if there's
approach.
a planned large operating unbudgeted expense, I still think
Well, sure, that
it
would
should
be,
come to us.
part of it. We're
Yeah.
over budget.
Councilman Kelly?
I just want to say, within the funds, we don't want to start micromanaging the sub-funds of the funds. And I think sometimes you'll have overruns for capital projects, but there's that we don't want to. So I would be careful on that. I still maintain that we simply need expenses, whether it's operating costs or CIP projects, that are going to lead us to exceeding the total adopted in the name for what's legal and for transparency, what's exceeding the approved fund amount. I don't want to micromanage within, which is what you're suggesting. If a project is running over, but they're able to shift funds within a given approved fund, I don't need to discuss that necessarily. As
Well,
long as
I
we're
think
staying-
that's
if we're
point
staying-
4.
As long as
Yeah.
we're staying within the approved fund. But I do think that every fund that we have voted on and adopted an amount, if it's going to exceed by, I would say less than 500,000, if there is an expenditure that's going to bring us in to exceed that amount by 250,000, I think that's a lot, but then that should be brought to us. And I don't think it's anything really more complicated than that. I don't know why we, need to.
Committee Member McMillan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I appreciate the idea of bringing down expenses, within a fund after you've, exceeded. I've sent some information to Chairman Reiches on this. I would love to see that incorporated into minimally Luke Stowe's, goals and objectives on the finance portion of how he's judged, and I would encourage him to do that for anybody who has a P&L under them. I just think it's a best practice. Otherwise, I don't think we can have as much discipline as we want to.
Okay, Committee Member Livingston?
Well, I think I was fine. I think this should be focused on capital. If we want to have a separate operating expense discussion, it's almost a separate policy. I don't want to micromanage anything either. I thought the original idea here was to react to things like Little Beans, so we could discuss it, and it's material, and it's unbudgeted, and it's on the capital side. But at some point, we brought operating expenses into this, and it sounds like there's some disagreement about whether this does have to address operating expenses or not. I think getting a policy on capital would be a good step forward, and then we can, from Mitesh and his team, more periodically look at where do we stand relative to the operating expense budgets for the year. So I'd be happy to just make this capital related. And I think 500,000 is a reasonable number.
Is there a consensus on that? No.
I think that that was my assumption going into this, is that this was limited to capital. Now, I think it does make a lot of sense to track operational expenses as well, but maybe that's a separate discussion that follows very closely along behind this one. So I'd be comfortable with what Mr. Livingston is proposing.
Why don't you want to talk about operational? I mean, if we're the budget committee, why would you not want to talk about that as well?
I think we can just schedule that quarterly where Atesh could give us an update on where we are operationally on our operating expenses and identify those items that are running in his forecast over budget. I'm not opposed to talking about operating expenses. I think we're kind of mixing apples and oranges here. Let's talk about big capital items when they come up, and let's periodically, we can determine what that periodic period is, look at a full year forecast, and Hitesh and his team can say these are operating expenses where I now believe we're going to be over $500,000 unfavorable to budget for the year, and we talk about why.
I mean, how often has it happened that you've had operating expenses that have exceeded 500,000 unbudgeted?
Salaries.
Literally everything we just talked about as part of the budget amendment. So it was things like the collective wage increases. It was things like the transfer to fleet and the transfer to insurance. It's the capital projects that we then transferred money to. And on the operating side, I think the things the fire truck that we just talked about.
Yeah.
Technically
So I do think it's, I mean, as the finance committee, I think the focus will be on the capital projects, but I personally would like to see these other items if they're unbudgeted, because we do discuss them anyway, so.
The other piece is like one-time uses of excess reserves that maybe a council member comes up with, where they want to spend so much money on some initiative using excess reserves, like we've heard that before.
And would it give you more guidance if we had a policy that we, as a committee, followed for, the general fund, the sewer fund,
If we're
and
treating
the
it as like
capital?
a policy around one-time things that are $500,000 or more and unbudgeted, I think that'd be fine.
Okay, I know there's some debate here, but
I have one question. How do we look at the overages and the TIFs? There was overspending in a TIF. I don't understand how that happens.
And how do the mechanics work with
Yeah.
that? Like, how does it get covered? Who paid for it?
And
how
some
does
of those were big.
Good evening, Chair and the members of the committee. So yeah, the two aspects in special service areas and TIPS. Now TIPS, some of them have a healthy fund balance. So we do have a deficit fund, We try to kind of draw upon the existing fund balance. And the projects, just like the more or less, those are the capital projects where you see whether on the infrastructure side, handled by the Public Works, or some of the economic development program, which is handled by Paul Zelmazek and his team. So yeah, sometimes it is dependent on the external factors. City staff have less control when would that happen. So they might budget it this year and it doesn't happen. Or next time it's not budgeted, but suddenly, something comes around, it's the right opportunity in the economic development all, and we kind of spend the money on that. But obviously, everything which you see there, even in the TIF, is the bigger numbers, has come to the City Council for their approval.
But what,
Okay, we have
No, sorry,
one
this
more
is
thing on the agenda.
But
and
on
then-
the TIF, so like the $821,000 that wasn't budgeted in the 5/5 TIF, where did that get paid from? Just so we all understand.
So the 515, since I think this was the first year, right? So we were not sure, and we want to make sure we see the revenue first before we budget that. And the TIF is, I think, contiguous with the West Evanston TIF, so we can port the money from one to the other.
But where did it come from? Where did we pay that overage of $821,000? Did we pull it? Where did the money come from? Where do we see it? Did it come from the West End TIF?
It must have been transferred from West Evanston.
It must have been? Okay,
Yeah.
so then that will go back into the West End TIF?
I mean, it is up to the City Council to, but right now.
Well, that's really important, that's all very transparent. The same with, I see several TIFs. Sorry, but
Back to the policy, and we
Okay,
can,
so
we
with
could
regard
talk.
with regard to the policy, I want to be clear, like with the little beans, What I'm referring to is approved budgets, fund budgets with approved projects, that those may go up or down within a fund. I'm not talking about brand-new projects, of course, that weren't budgeted at all. Of course,
Right,
those should
right.
come to us. But it is, just like the salaries, when we increase the salaries, I'm sure we would have approved them, but when we have that sort of a thing where we're approving operational, it's all the same. We have truth and taxation hearings by fund. I don't see why we wouldn't
Okay,
want
I
anything that exceeds
I think
those
that,
to come to us.
So Laura, thank you very, very much. I know you've spent a lot of time on this. I think the consensus here is we're going to go with the 4 items you have here, and then you have on the bottom the next steps. You're going to do some analysis to see how much impact it would have been. And I do like adding some of the funds we discussed today, the bigger funds, because wages, things like that would be great to come to us. I think it would give good guidance to staff. But you're going to look at the analysis to see how many times this would occur. We really don't want to have these emergency meetings, every other week. So we want to see how often that would occur. And then if you can come with the policy with your analysis of 250 versus 500, and hopefully we'll have enough to vote on at the next meeting. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, thank you very much. Now we went at the PPRT discussion. Just to give you some history, thank you, Councilman Kelly, and the president of our fire and police. And we also have our legal counsel, I believe, online. We have spent a lot of time. I know more about PPRT than I ever thought I would. The good news, the really good news, is we have passed a pension policy, and staff has been in compliance with the policy since the time that we have passed it. We have funded 100%. The questions are the components of that 100%. And I would like, Clayton, if you can start, and then we can have Jack come up and give, and then we have legal counsel who's going to give their opinion. We're probably not going to have a final decision today, but the recommendation from legal counsel is that either we will make a recommendation, but eventually the council will be approving the definition of 100% PPRT allocation.
Yes, and I'm not here to, I won't be part of the conversation on the merits of PPRT or not.
Just the facts. Everyone's just presenting the facts
just
today.
The numbers from this slide. So, as you said, the good news is last year we made sure that the pensions received their full budgeted amount and then some. So the pensions received 102% of required funding last year. The policy set that at 100%. Some of that overage came from the property tax loss factor that we talked about last month. So because we collected more than the net levy, they were able to collect an extra 2% over the 100%. So you can see in 2023, we gave $5.1 million to the pension funds from other sources. Those include PPRT and unrestricted revenues, which is more than the $4.1 million that we received in PPRT. So they received that full $25.6 million. And you can see that means that 80% of pensions were paid for last year by the property tax levy, which is a huge swing from previous years, where you can see 97%, 97% of our pensions obligations have been covered with the property tax levy. And last year was the first time that dropped significantly because we provided the extra money out of the excess reserves. We've looked at this a couple different ways. You can see this line here stays fairly flat in terms of the amount of money provided to the pensions from PPRT and unrestricted revenues at $605,000, with the exception of 2 years here in 2019 and 2020. In both of those years, we actually had we set a low loss factor. We collected less than the net levy in those years, and we came back after the fact using general fund, available general fund money to cover that difference and made sure that they were made whole. So in each year here, from 2018 through 2022, our target was 90% funding by 2040. We were 100% or more in each of those years. And then in 2023, as I said, the target was 100% by 2040, and they ended up receiving 102%. So those are the numbers and the breakdown of sort of pension obligations and coverage throughout the time frame.
So the big question is, the one line that says total from other sources. And you're next.
Good evening. Appreciate the opportunity to have an in-depth discussion on PPRT as it relates to the policy. And my name is Jack Mortel, for the record, president of the Evanston Firefighters Pension Board, 70-plus years in Evanston, retired captain of the Evanston Fire Department, currently live in the First Ward. So, like I said, I appreciate this opportunity not to be squished into 3 minutes of public comment. I'd like the little house cleaning prior to digging into the meat of this personal property replacement tax situation. Tim Schoolmaster, the president of the pension board, police pension board, sends his regrets. We have been in constant communication. He agrees completely with the documents that I have presented through emails and what I have to say regarding those documents tonight. Again, we both want to respect your time, and we really thank you. So I've sent you a load of material I've got laid out there. So if you have questions, I might jump over there and say, how'd you come up with this, Jack? I'll go, and this is material from the state, from the state departments, and from the city itself. So there's some points I want to make up prior that are to clear up any prior confusion. So let's see. Number one, and this is, since Hitesh has been at the helm of the finance department, as they just said, there's been more than 100% of ADC contributed toward the public safety pensions. That's not in dispute. That's also in the policy that it says 100% or more. This is just a continuation of what's being done, but now it's official. Because this was never a fixed amount approved by the city council, but that contribution was made. This is going to make it official. That's the policy cleans it up. But this is something that's always been done. And 100% or more, I think at times it's been a little bit more, but at other times, Hitesh, I could have to go back to other videos, you've provided a great deal amount more. So this is not unusual to give more. The policy is not 100% policy, it's 100% policy or more. That's even reinforced in another document. That's the first thing I want to clear up. And he's correct, the loss factor, that's what creates the additional 100% more and more. The pension fund policy went into full effect July 24th, 2023, and I think we turned a big page there. Prior to that, the pension situation with the police and fire, this was an open wound that wasn't closed. This committee, you sutured that close. That was a big deal to us, very visceral. But it was in effect July 24th. Since at least 2019, when Hitesh was at the helm, a PPR contribution was made to the public safety pensions to lower the public safety pension lien. And I believe that's gone back decades. They've used that for a number of years. Hitesh, would you agree to that they've always applied PPRT, and that's lowered the lien? You can see there it's also a little bit, it's gone toward it. That isn't in dispute. And I apologize, I don't have any displays, but I had information coming in up to like 3 o'clock today. And at 3 o'clock today, I heard from our corporate counsel, Ruggie, that actually, I'm trying to, 100% of PPRT is allowable to put toward the public safety pensions. That was from corporate counsel. I got that today. That's a huge thing. That changes the nature.
She mentioned there's a minimum, but it is allowable. So.
And
she's online.
Yeah, I know, but that's what the policy says is the maximum allowable. That's 100%. I don't know how that is in debate anymore. That's why I'm trying to make these points. I want to move past these points.
Can you bring up the policy, those 5 points on here?
Thank you. Well, number 2, it's the maximum allowable PPRT allocation. That's linked to number 1 above. That could actually be 1 point. A pension property tax levy that is the same dollar value level as the prior year, adjusted for allocated PPRT per item 2 below. It doesn't say 3, 4, 5. It says those two are linked. You can't unlink them. PPRT is 100%. That's what our corporate counsel says. Okay, we're the turning point here. I had hoped that we had turned a page when we signed this thing, when it got signed up last July. So and the final house cleaning thing is, let's see, for at least, okay, those are all points that I'm trying to, I have, then the next point I want to make is really good news, and I have to apologize to Council Member Newsma. When he talked to me about PPRT, I kind of got hung up on IMRF, but I use that as a really prime example of how defined benefit pensions can work well when they're well funded. And this is really good news. I'm not sure if everyone knew, incidentally, Evanston was one of the 5 municipal bodies that started the IMRF. It's a big deal. It's a huge fund. And in Evanston alone, this is Evanston's account, because they did pretty well last year, I think 13% interest. And I've talked to I've emailed the president for IMRF. He doesn't have the final number yet, but it looks like IMRF and our account's going to be over $350 million. That's just in Evanston. That's not the state account. People think it's not. I think this committee was kind of mentioned, oh, that must be the state. That's just in Evanston. And overfunded, 100% beyond the 100 funding, it's going to be somewhere $65 to $70 million over. That's an asset for Evanston that we use against our other debts. This is huge.
Okay, because I want to get, we only have 5 minutes, and I want to get the legal counsel on. So
okay,
if you can.
But, well, this is an in-house comparison. Everyone else, you know, what does Palatine do? What are they? We're heroes for starting this. The people before us to start the IMRF, it's a wonderful thing. It's something to be proud of. This city embraces pensions, defined benefit pensions. So I've got 3 points that I'd like to make, and I wanted to focus on this, and I want to focus on July 24th going forward. I do disagree with that we're not following the policy if we act as if 100% is a ceiling. It's not. It's a start. So I believe that I've sent you documents. Right around $1.3 million came in PPRT after the document was signed. That was not put into it could have gone into toward the payment. It would have paid dividends well beyond that down the line. That's the directions. That was the direction. I didn't discover it until that it wasn't put in there. I was actually alarmed and surprised that it wasn't. I told you about this open wound. You know, this is like 9 months later that the first payment came in. That's like ripping that wound open, that you're not going to follow the policy that just got passed. And why we have an open wound, it's broken promises, pension holidays of this. So there's an expression of slippery slope. If we don't put that PPRT into some sort of escrow account for if we come up short this year or next year, we're just going back to where it was in the past. Like, oh, if we get away with it this time, why not do it next time? Oh, it's not convenient this time. That has to be avoided. The second thing is, I'd like to see that established, a escrow account, at least for the members I talked to on this committee separately, and they contacted me separately. They said, that'd be a nice solution. We'll just put it in an escrow account. And actually, with corporate counsel Ruggie, she even mentioned, I'll make sure I wrap that up in an escrow account. I was told that last week with Councilmember Kelly and Chairman Rikus. Remember, she said that. So I hope this is wrapped up, and that we don't find out, oh, well, that's gone now. And it really can't be gone, because we have, there was a talk about transparency. What's not transparent is PPRT is not transparent. I've been keeping a record and bringing it to the council, but you can't find it anywhere, yourself. But there's also things that should be transparent. That's additional unrestricted funds in the general fund. What's the amount of unrestricted fund in the general fund? What's the unrestricted general fund reserves? What's the unrestricted revenues? Excess fund balances in the other unrestricted city funds. That policy said those should be recognized for this possibly, but we have no way of seeing, if you're going to make decisions, if you're going to carve it up, we've got no way of how much are in those piles. That's the lack of transparency. It's a huge lack of transparency. This, I don't know how you guys can make decisions if you don't even know what's in your wallet. You go in a store, it's not a credit card. Someone said earlier about, you spend, we got to know what we have. And how can we make really informed decisions or even half-informed decisions unless we know what's in all these accounts? Now this, as I sent in an early thing, I think I outlined these in red. We should have those accounts. I'm not sure why it's so tough, and I'm not sure why anyone on this committee or the staff would push against showing these amounts. Like I think Council Member Kelly said, there's I don't know how many times you had to ask for this, but finally they said, yeah, you know what, you got $27 million. That's unattached to anything. We're not a for-profit business. We have reserves. Anything over that is like we're turning a profit. Budgets are not supposed to be designed that way. And we should be spending those down, the unattached ones, to give our guys a little bit of relief. And I'll say again, this the property tax relief we get from the PPRT, that translates to overall property tax relief, because I've asked Clayton in an email, I've asked these guys, I says, okay, if you use 605 or use a larger amount, do you have to raise these other levies? Now, I asked that May 1st. I've never gotten an answer, and I take that to be that the answer is no. I mean, that's been a kind of a old wives' tale here. No, if you use PPRT to lower the levy, that's why it's better to use PPRT than unrestricted funds. There's a few taxpayers in this room. You save money. We save money. This is a way. Last night we're talking about efficiency and everything else. If you use that PPRT and it's named, it doesn't like get washed through a fund. If you look at the Illinois Department of Revenue document, it says it must. It says it must be done. I'll close with this, right? Hang on. This is a great document. They talk about the levy.
Can you bring that document up that he's, the one we talked about today?
It's the second page, first thing on top of the second page. And thanks. It says, I'll just read the part, you can read the whole thing, but it says, the basic intent of the law, PPRT law, is to prevent excessive taxation of real estate. Those aren't my words. That's what it's supposed to be used for. It's not supposed to be flipped into the budget and be unrestricted revenue that becomes, I think it goes in as unrestricted revenue and morphs into excess revenue. So, or excess reserves.
Okay. And
So
Clayton, can you go up one page? There was one section there. See the right there. Can you read that out loud? The allocation of PPRT fund for the pension obligation, local government. I'm reading it. It says MRF and Social Security, police, and pension. Right now, we're not using IMRF or Social Security. We're just putting in the pension. But I'd like to turn it over to our legal counsel because she has reviewed this. She has reviewed our policy. She has talked to the taxing authorities. So,
yeah, but just the last sentence in number 2 that you just brought up, it clearly says the local government unit must reduce its own tax levy for pensions. When you lower that tax levy, it lowers the overall levy.
okay. And thank you for Mr. Motel. He has done so much work, and I know Clayton Hadesh, you have given us so much feedback and information, and Councilman Kelly has done a lot of work. And I'd like to just turn it over to our legal counsel because this is a very big decision that we want to just come up with an answer, because it's come up. And Councilman Kelly, I'll let you go after legal counsel.
Thank you, Chair and members of the Finance and Budget Committee. Alex Ruggie, Corporation Counsel for the City of Evanston. So, as the Chair mentioned, I did have an opportunity to review the PPRT Illinois statute as well as our current pension funding policy. And Mr. Mortel is correct. I said that the PPRT may be allocated at 100% for pension funding. What I also specified is that the City of Evanston, the Finance Department, my department, we would be looking to City Council for that direction on exactly how much of this would go into the pension funding from PPRT. When I was looking at this, I really took a moment to look at the legislative history of the pension policy. That's how lawyers interpret the laws that are passed. And, you know, I think there was direction in the pension policy originally to specify where the funding had to come from in a prioritization list. That language was taken out. The language as it stands now says that the money for that 100% can come from one or more of the following. So when I read any one or more of the following, I read it to be you can take from all of the below, you can take from one, you can take from two. It doesn't specify which one and in which order. So from our standpoint, if it's the City Council's desire to direct 100% of that PPRT into the pensions, we would just be looking to an amendment of this policy so that it's clearer for the staff. As everyone mentioned, the pensions have been hitting that 100% or more, so we have been following the policy. I did meet with Mr. Martel and several other people last week, and I said I would discuss with Hitesh and Clayton placing that money in an escrow. What I did is when I talked to Hitesh and Clayton, what they stated was that it would be best and most transparent to place this as a part of an assigned fund balance in the audit report pending that City Council decision so that it is transparent and we can follow this. And then that way everyone can know where that fund balance goes. But everything that I've looked at, and I know that the statute says that we have to allocate it to offset it. The statute's talking about is the minimum requirement. So the city has always gone above and beyond the statutorily minimum required amount. But now we're just wondering on that maximum amount, what is the city's goal? The state said to look at our ordinance. We don't have a budget ordinance that specifies where revenues go. So we do need the City Council to clarify that. So that would be my legal recommendation.
And what's the minimum again? It's been that
minimum
605.
Is how much the city contributed in 1970 to pensions. I think it's 4.7-ish%, if I'm not mistaken.
And also thank you, because we did meet, I believe, on Thursday, and you spent a lot of time in the last 3 days getting us answers. So thank you. Councilman Kelly?
Thank you. And thank you, Corporation Counsel Ruggie and Jack Mortel, for your work on this. So it is confirmed that we can, and we said we would apply the maximum amount allowable. And I know at the time we were sort of debating, is it legal or not by state statute? And thank you, Alexander Ruggie, for confirming that we can. So I do believe that our intention was 1, 2, 3, that was an order, meaning those are the sources that we would tap into to allocate the appropriate funding to reach 100%. So I do feel, in order just to provide assurance from a history that's been somewhat marred in terms of our pension, we continue to have an enormous pension deficit liability. I would like us this evening to direct staff to create that escrow account so that all the PPRT pensions go into an escrow account. So there is transparency. I don't see any harm in that. I think most of us, I hope, agree on that. If we could go ahead and vote, I would like to motion that we vote to direct staff to create an escrow account for 100% of the PPRT funding to be deposited into that, to also then be allocated towards our pensions as the maximum amount allowable has now been confirmed that is 100%.
Councilman Newsman? Is there a second?
I second.
Yeah, there could be discussion. Committee member Livingston?
Right. So I think I was as close to the pension policy or closer than anyone as to how we intended to put this together, and I responded to the overall group earlier on sort of my views on this. The first part of the policy says we will make a contribution based on an actuarial calculation to get to 100% funding by 2040. And that number currently is about $26 million a year. And that is what we owe the two plans. And I think everyone agrees that. We owe them. We can discretionarily, use our discretion if we sell some assets or whatever to put some additional funds within that. But the actuary tells us, based on our current funding position and our goal of full funding by 2040, that we need to put this amount of money into the plan this year based on the current asset level, current nature of the participants in the plan, and other actuarial assumptions. I don't think there's any disagreement. That's what it says. The second part of the policy that Mr. Martell is talking about is how we fund that required contribution of approximately $26 million. It comes from a variety of sources, and really the primary point of this section was to define when we trigger a required property tax increase, if we do, to continue to make that contribution. Because it explicitly said, this policy says if we don't have sufficient reserves in the general fund to make this contribution, the city council will raise the property tax so that we will make the full contribution. It's taking away the discretion that was there previously, because I agree, Jack, we don't want to go back to the old days where we're not making the recommended contribution, and in fact, we agreed to make much more than we were making before. We unilaterally said we want to be fully funded by 2040. There's no state law that says you need to be fully funded by 2040. We said we want to get this behind us. So this section is set up to say, if the general fund, which is where this money comes from, is in deficit and does not have excess reserves, what's the mechanics to calculate what the required property tax increase is? And that is what this section is. And so what do? Okay, we owe $26.5. Well, we're going to start with what's our specific levy. Currently, it was on the sheet that around $20 million. What's the maximum amount of PPRT that can go to this? That would be our current estimate of what PPRT is. And then what are our available general fund reserves? If those are zero, that number is zero, then the net result is, are we short a few $1 million? If we're short a few $1 million, that is the allowable increase in the property tax amount.
Please speak to the motion. We're discussing the motion.
Well,
right
okay, I am against an escrow account because I don't think we need to tie the city's hands. We owe them the contribution. We don't, and that can come from a variety of sources. And we have other budgetary needs within the city that we've been talking about extensively. So I believe to tie PPRT into an escrow account is completely unnecessary. PPRT only really comes into this calculation when we determine we're short, and we need to, how do we calculate the any required property tax increase? And in fact, this language limits the amount of property tax increase that we can do, because it says you have to deduct the maximum amount of the PPRT, which would be the current year budget. So I don't think it makes sense to tie the city's hands and say PPRT has to go into an escrow account and can only be used for one thing. We have already adopted a policy that says we will make that contribution. And at the end of the day, we've given, I think, the city council cover to go ahead and raise the property tax if we're out of excess reserves. So I would say an escrow account is unnecessary, but it also ties our hands relative to be using PPRT or any other sources of unrestricted revenue for other very valid needs of the city. So that's my
Councilman Newsman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question about the state policy. And before I can really make up my mind on any of these questions, I want to make sure I understand what the state guidance is. Can we pull that slide back up? It's
That's
at page
the-
36
yeah.
of 47 or page 6 of 10 in our packet. Yeah, if you go down to the bottom of that one. So is this, and so we have Corporation Counsel Ruggie still on the phone. What are our obligations under state law? I've got it right here, check, for the use of PPRT funds. What does state law tell us we have to do or we can do?
So state law specifies that when the PPRT statute was passed in 1970, it requires municipalities to place the same percentage of the corporate tax that they collected and allocated towards pensions. They require that same percentage of the PPRT then to go towards pensions. So in 1970, if we used that corporate tax to pay 4 or 5% towards our pensions, we now have to do that minimally every year going forward. So that's what the state law says.
If you could go up to the previous page. The last line on that page says, any PPRT funds remaining after satisfying the two liens should be used for the same purpose as real estate taxes. So let's go up one line before that. So paragraph number 2 at the bottom. The second lien, actually, let's even back up further. Let's back up to the top. Personal property replacement tax provisions require, number 1, municipalities must pay a portion of each PPRT check received to the respective libraries if the library tax was levied on or before December 31st, 1978.
Yeah, that doesn't apply to us.
That was my first question.
Yeah.
Does that apply to us? No. Okay. So then number 2, do we have a road district?
No.
So that doesn't apply to us. So that brings us to the next point here.
We don't have any bonds before 1978.
Do we have any bonds before 1978? No.
Oh.
So
I've been through
there's,
this.
like, the only possible other use here would be governed by section, or the second paragraph 2, before we can use it for a general fund. Okay, so let's look at the second paragraph 2. The second lien on PPRT funds each calendar year is for pension obligations, et cetera, all pension obligations must be satisfied before the funds can be used for other purposes. So I think that's the crux.
That's the main
of the
question
matter,
that we've been trying to get
right?
the legal,
So-
and can you give your opinion on that again?
And so let's keep that sentence in mind, but go to the spreadsheet, if you could, a few pages before, that shows we brought in PPRT 4,870,000, right? Or whatever. Yeah.
4,087,000 and 5,000,001.
If that's the number we're bringing in, are we to interpret that state law to mean the first use of that 400,000 is pensions, and we can't use any of it for anything else until pensions are fully.
So what they've done is they've allocated 605 to pensions, put the PPRT in the general fund, and then taken it out of the general fund. And what I think the question here is, do we want to say 100% of the PPRT is going to be used? And if so, as we get the PPRT and we keep it in the escrow, knowing that it is there for use for the pension. This is what I'm understanding. But then talking to Hitesh, there is some disadvantages of doing 100% PPRT.
But am I at least narrowing in on the right question?
This is the right question.
Okay, so I'll take that as
The
good
the
feedback.
difference is, and I just, and I think Alex touched on that subject. When you say that, go back to that first page, which is very important, the language and the interpretation. read that thing. Pension obligation must be satisfied before the funds can be used for other purpose. And then it says, see page 2 for the calculation. So, and when you go to the page, yeah, this is where it says that before, or in 1970 or before 79, if pensions were funded, say 10%, out of that tax, then you should still give them, even today, 10% of the current levy out of PPRT to them, And that's why they have the example explaining here. Obviously, we don't have any bonds which were issued before the 79, but we have the tax levy, So we have to give. Now, I explained that, I was looking through the last 10, 15, 20 years audit, and in the audit worksheet, I found this note where they say 4.76% should go.
That's the minimum.
Yes, that is the required under this formula, that at that time, 4.76% was funded by the PPRT. So we should, not the PPRT, the previous personal property tax on the business side. So that's where 4.76, that is the minimum statutory required. That is my understanding. The proportionate side. And even in IDOR, you would see that like a title on the top right, Clayton, if you go to the first page on the top right, look at this thing, calculation of the proportionate share. So that's like they're talking about the percentage.
If I could just interrupt here. So
Sure.
I think what we're talking about, if I'm understanding correctly, is the state guidance says all pension obligations must be satisfied, right? According to the state's calculation, not according to what we say is 100% for contribution
No,
for the
all
year.
obligations must be satisfied means whatever the percentage they were getting before, they should get it first out of the PPRT before you use it as a real estate transfer tax.
Okay, I think the other meeting is waiting outside,
Okay.
so let's wrap this up in 3 minutes, but
Thank you for
gonna
helping me
resolve it to-
understand that. I'm not all the way there, but I'm getting closer.
Councilmember,
Bottom line,
can I jump in?
Sure.
Very briefly. So I see what you're saying. So when it says all pension obligations must be met, so the obligation it's referring to is the statutory obligation of that percentage we paid in 1970. So I just want to clarify. You and Hitesh are on the same page.
Right.
and can you repeat what the statutory obligation is again? The 10%?
No, it's 4.76% because it's
Okay,
based
so
on
we
what
have
we
to
contributed
satisfy
to
that.
pensions in 1970.
Okay, and
Yes,
then we have an
to satisfy that.
overriding policy that commits us to 100% funding from 5 different sources.
Right. Okay, but in the state guidance where it says pension obligations, it's not referring to city policy, it's referring to that calculation. Okay, that helps me understand. Specific to the motion on the table, I am not in favor of an escrow account for the reasons that Mr. Livingston has suggested. We have many, many other obligations to the city of Evanston, in addition to our very important pension obligation. And we need to be able to make the call based on the situation in whatever it is in future years, and I would not want to tie the hands of future councils to.
Okay, and we're going to go to Councilman Kelly one last time because we do have to vote because there are people waiting out
So
there.
we did pass a policy that said we would apply the maximum allowable amount of our PPRT towards our pensions. Now, we have an obligation first and foremost to our residents, and our residents have been harmed by the by underfunding of our pensions to the point where most of our property tax levy for the city is going towards the interest on this liability. It is our obligation to do whatever we can to our residents to reduce this harm. And that part of that, and that is what we can see from the PPRT, that the intention is geared towards paying down your pensions. And I've had extensive communications with the manager, the local tax allocation division manager for the Illinois Department of Revenue, and I believe Ms. Ruggi's also spoken with him to say, absolutely, you can apply 100% of your PPRT allocation to this. And if we wanted to set up an escrow with the state, we could do that, but he said there's no reason to do that, just set up your own escrow account. We need transparency. We need to reduce this outstanding, incredibly huge debt that we have to the public safety pensions. as best we can. And there is absolutely no reason, I don't see what possible harm you could see in setting up an escrow account when we have already voted to apply the maximum amount allowable, which has now been confirmed by Alex Ruggie. That is 100% of it. We voted on this. Council voted on this. So now I'm hearing this pushback. In other words, it sounds like you're leaning towards making this a political football again, where we won't be applying this, and it'll force us maybe into a point where you're raising taxes. And this is incredibly disappointing. There's no reason not to bring transparency to these PPRT payments to ensure that they are going the maximum amount allowable to pay down our pensions to relieve taxpayers of that.
I'm going to let Hitesh speak. We're going to vote.
Right, but I also would like to hear from, we do liaison with the pension boards, and we do have the pension board president here. I think
we're going to have to continue this because there's people waiting outside, and we're not going to be able to resolve this because we don't have a clear legal opinion either, except to bring it to council to decide.
We have a legal opinion on what is allowable, and it's 100%. And that's what we were seeking. We said the maximum allowable, and it is 100%. We need to set up a transparent account so that we can.
Okay, Hitesh?
I mean, what I would conclude with, and I think Chair Livingston at that time, Chair, that the intent of this committee and the council was to give 100% funding, the goal, 100% funding by 2040 instead of 90%, and that's what we did, right, for the last year before that, and before that we complied with 90%, and that 90% funding was even more than the state minimum required under their statute, So I think that is the intent. So if the council wants to see something else, as Corporation Counsel Ruggie said, that, we can put this matter again to the city council and say this is what the intent is, which is already kind of been complied with, that 100% funding by 2040. We are giving that 100% actuarially determined contribution for the actuarial report. But yes, if you want to change, and even, to fix that, I don't know whether we want to suggest in item 2 where it says maximum allowable. I think the intent was the statutorily required contribution, and we all believe in, pension contribution, and I think that was the intent, to give 100% contribution, and not 100% PPRT. Now, one thing I would clarify when they say that, we can reduce the tax levy. Yes, we can reduce one tax levy. Where does the PPRT money go now? In general fund. So I would be short by that 2 million, 3 million, 5 million. How would I fill that gap? Obviously, I'll have to raise that tax levy.
So I'd like to hear from President Mortel. He did come here this evening, and I think we really want to just end what appears to be a shell game by setting up an escrow account. President Mortel.
When I brought this to the council and then to here, this was all about tax relief, long-term tax relief. That's what this, I would assume that's what this body is all about too. When you use PPRT directly for pension payments, that's a tax savings to all us homeowners. And I've asked, if you put that amount, what else would you have to levy? They have not, I asked that 2 weeks ago, they have not asked. I said, here's the levies, which one of these would you have to raise? They can't answer that. They want this shell game to continue. And I want to say the first year that we went to 100% funding, it had a $26.6 million reversal on our unfunded accrued actuarial liability. This works. I came to this for tax savings. I'm dug in about this. I pay taxes here too. That allowable PPRT, all of it should go directly to the pensions because then it's a tax savings. If you wash it through the general fund, it doesn't reduce our pension property tax lien. That would be a mistake. We have this wonderful opportunity to save us taxpayers some real dough here, and you're doing everything to dodge it.
Right.
I have to respond to that. I have to respond to that. Jack.
It's impossible, like you said before.
No, you're just going to create a hole in the general fund because that's where the money's going today.
Okay, then
you're just going to create a need to raise other funds for the general fund.
And I've asked them, David, I've asked them directly. They won't
We're
won't
already
answer me.
running a deficit of $10 million a year. Our excess reserves are going to be gone by the end of next year or so. which at one point, under this policy, to continue to fund it 100%, we have defined a mechanism which would raise the property tax to continue to.
After using 100%
fund.
of the PPRT.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So that's
Exactly.
why, so why not
But
create an
that's the
account?
mechanism, that is the mechanism, when we get there, this is defining what the property tax
It is very,
increase.
if we take 100% of the PPRT and we keep it flat, and then we tap into excess reserves if needs be, it's highly, highly unlikely we'll ever need to raise taxes. But if we follow you and Hitesh, this idea of, oh, let's not allocate 100% of PPRT, you are leading us down the road to making a political football once again out of the, yes, you are, out of public
Not at
safety
all.
pensions. So
I
I ask
think
that
that-
we, what is the harm in setting up an escrow account
Because
for
right
the
now-
deposits of PPRT?
I'm going to call the question on the motion.
Let's call the question.
Yeah. And I think I might have to abstain from voting because I'm on the pension board.
I don't,
You don't think so? Okay.
I don't know. We can ask the legal counsel.
Okay.
If that's the case, you shouldn't be on the pension board.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So we have a motion.
We have a motion. Councilmember Burns is no longer on the call and not voting. So I will start again with Councilmember Nusma. On the proposal, Councilmember Kelly motioned to direct staff to create an escrow account for PPRT to use towards pension. So Councilmember Nusma.
No.
Committee Member Livingston.
No.
Chair Rikus.
No.
Councilmember Kelly.
Yes.
Committee Member McMillan.
Yes, there's no downside.
Councilmember Wynn. 4-2 against.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Adjourned.